within the hearing of the Trojan feather, the proceeding that neither announced itself nor waited for permission to begin, skepticism arrived, the way it always arrives, not through the door, through the proceedings themselves. The subject matter has the specific quality of a wound that has not been permitted to close. Each testimony delivered, each receipt surfaced, each documented pattern named aloud has widened the aperture for what the viewer is being asked to hold simultaneously. Sensitivity is not a weakness in this proceeding. It is the appropriate response to what is being witnessed. A growing picture has emerged. Tokenomics, The Trojan Feather, Episode 5, The Architecture of Almost, Two Strategies, both documented, both tried, both came close. The working within strategy built documented gains inside the existing framework. The working outside strategy built documented achievements outside it. Both met the same documented counter-mechanism at the same documented threshold. Both were interrupted before the compounding was complete.
Okay, here is the start of our deep dive into the claims that foundational Black Americans have no culture, and also foundational Black West Indians are not significantly present as a staple present and accounted for in the creation of America. In the 1640s, Barbados ran out of land. The sugar revolution transformed the island. Every acre went to sugar production. The planters who arrived late, or whose holdings were too small, needed somewhere to expand. They looked north. They found a coastline that reminded them of home. That decision shaped Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia permanently. North Carolina, the receipt. May 29, 1664. A group of Barbadian settlers under a merchant named John Vassall got off their ships on the Cape Fear River. They built a settlement. Called it Charlestown. Within 2 years it had grown to 800 people. This was the first English settlement in what is now North Carolina. It was built by Barbadians. One of the 8 men who chartered the entire Carolina colony in 1663 was Sir John Colleton, a Barbadian planter. The explorer the Barbadians hired to scout the coastline was Captain William Hilton. His name survives today at Hilton Head, South Carolina. South Carolina, the receipt. 1670. Sir John Yeamans, another Barbadian, organized the successful settlement at Charleston. Between 1/3 and 1/2 of the people brought to South Carolina in its early decades to provide enslaved labor came not from Africa directly but from the Caribbean, primarily Barbados. This is documented by the College of Charleston's Lowcountry Digital History Initiative. Charleston was the largest point of entry for enslaved people in North American history. The families that became the most powerful in colonial South Carolina, the Middletons, the Draytons, the Gibbeys, had Barbadian origins. They shaped the colony's politics, economy, and legal architecture. During the 18th century, more than half of all enslaved Africans who entered British North America passed through Charleston. The Cape Fear settlement was eventually abandoned. But it established the pattern. And it sits at the northern edge of where the Gullah Geechee community historically lived, the community that preserved more documented African cultural tradition than any other in North America. That is not a coincidence. That is architecture.
Caribbean Heritage Month, the Virginia Tidewaters Sertept. Before America had a founding document, before it had a flag, before it had a name, it had a labor architecture. And that architecture was Caribbean. This is the receipt that Caribbean Heritage Month was not designed to surface, but that the documented record demands be stated precisely. In the 1640s, The island of Barbados underwent what historians document as the Sugar Revolution. The entire island's resources, its land, its labor, its legal architecture were committed to sugar production. A handful of enslaved Africans had accompanied the first settlers in the 1620s. By 1660, that number had grown to approximately 20,000. Barbados had become the wealthiest English colony in the Americas. It had also become the laboratory in which the British Empire developed its specific model of chattel slavery. The Barbados Slave Code of 1661 was the documented result, the first comprehensive slave code in the English colonies. The legal architecture that defined what an enslaved African was, what rights they did not have, and what mechanisms would be used to control them, written in Barbados, exported everywhere. What happened next is the receipt Caribbean Heritage Month does not discuss, but cannot honestly omit. The Virginia acting governor documented in 1680 that what Negroes were brought to Virginia were imported generally from Barbados, for it was very rare to have a Negro ship come to this country directly from Africa. Until Bacon's Rebellion in 1676, most people brought to Virginia to provide slave labor were imported from the Caribbean islands rather than shipped directly from Africa. The foundational Black American community in Virginia's Tidewater region, the community that would build the documented resistance architecture of the 18th and 19th centuries, the community whose descendants bore the weight of every documented restriction that followed every organized sovereignty attempt, was populated in its formative period primarily from Barbados and the Caribbean. It began in chains, in transit, through Barbados, arriving in the Virginia Tidewater before the United States of America existed as a legal entity. The community that bore the weight of every documented restriction after Vesey, after Turner, after every organized sovereignty attempt across the colonial and antebellum periods, was in significant part a community whose documented origin was Caribbean. Both communities have always been one documented story. Details are our advantage. This receipt written properly, every claim documented. The Virginia Acting Governor's 1680 statement is the anchor. It is a primary source document. The Barbados Slave Code of 1661 became the documented model for Virginia's slave codes. The enslaved people processed through Barbados became the documented foundation of the Virginia Tidewater's black population. The same island that produced the legal framework produced the community that would be governed by it. Two things came from Barbados to Virginia simultaneously: the code and the people. The code was written to govern. That is the receipt. For Caribbean Heritage Month, the series notes the foundational Black West Indian contribution to American history did not begin with voluntary immigration in the 1900s. It did not begin with Alexander Hamilton in the 1700s. The story of Black America cannot be told without the story of foundational Black West Indians, whose bloodline in America is receipted in the Carolinas and Georgia as being brought in as slaves with the fully working blueprint that America's success sits on today. If it's true that true foundational Black Americans do not have immigrants in their family or persons from other than America's soil, then the FB West Indians are the only documented connection of the transatlantic slave trade that directly connects the South in becoming the chief cornerstone of America's success. FBA ancestors would have been drafted into the new slave codes that was imported It was never created on American soil.
Martin Luther King Jr. stood up after the panel and said no. His answer was not delivered as an argument. It was delivered as a sermon, because he understood that the debate was not about tactics. It was about whether the existing framework, left to its own architecture, would ever produce what it had promised. That debate did not begin in Denver in 1956. It began 91 years earlier in Savannah, Georgia, January 12, 1865, and it has not ended. What you are about to witness is the documented record of both strategies, both at full strength, both with receipts, both presented without a winner declared. The viewer decides.
September 1956. Denver, Colorado. The National Baptist Convention held its annual meeting. The symposium title, National Baptist Facing Integration, Shall Gradualism Be Applied? The largest black organization in America, 5 million members, debating whether to move slowly. The president of that organization was Joseph Harrison Jackson. He had been elected in 1953 with the help of two men, Martin Luther King Sr. and Martin Luther King Jr. He was the most powerful black religious leader in the country. His answer to the symposium's question was yes, gradualism, change through the courts, through the ballot, through loyalty to the democratic process, through the framework that existed. The young pastor, who had been leading a bus boycott in Montgomery, Alabama, for 10 months, stood up after the panel and denounced gradualism from the pulpit. The convention responded enthusiastically. Jackson bristled. He reportedly said, "We must not crown our heroes too quickly." The probability field in that room in Denver, in September 1956, shows me something I want you to see. Both men were right about what they were right about. Jackson was right that legal channels had value. The documented record shows the VRA produced real gains in documented wages, documented employment, documented political representation between 1965. King was right that gradualism without confrontational pressure would not force those legal channels to produce results. The documented record shows the gains came from the direct action years, Birmingham, Selma, the March on Washington, not from the patient waiting years. But the probability field also shows what neither man could see from Denver in 1956. The framework received both strategies' outputs. It received the gains. It received the frustration. It received the grief from the reversals. It is still receiving. The feather and the grief mother's hands came from the tradition that J.H. Jackson, Martin Luther King Sr. and Martin Luther King Jr. were all arguing about in Denver in 1956. The self-development architecture, the sovereignty vocabulary, the framework that says, you are the measure of your own truth. None of the three men named it that way, but it was present in that room. It is still present.